Why didn't George Washington become a king? A victorious conqueror, beloved by his people, topples the old regime and seizes the crown for himself. It's a typical story, repeated so often throughout history that it's almost predictable. But George Washington defied those expectations and refused to seize power after leading his nation's revolution against Britain. In this video, we'll explore the many reasons. We won't just look at why Washington didn't want to be king, but why his supporters didn't either. We'll also see how, even if Washington had wanted it, there were practical, philosophical, and even religious reasons why an American king was never on the cards. It makes sense to begin with the man himself. Washington was a talented battlefield general and an inspiring leader. That much is undebatable. He managed to lead the ragtag militia of Americans to victory over the legions of the mighty British Empire. Numerous episodes during the Revolutionary War, like the crossing of the Delaware or the victory at Yorktown, showed that Washington had the grit and strength of character to inspire admiration and lead by example. If anyone was searching for a king, Washington seemed to fit the bill perfectly. However, Washington had no interest in a crown. He was a committed Republican through and through. John Adams called Washington's attitude to power noble and disinterested, and his anti-monarchical values were trusted by all the other leading founding fathers. Washington considered monarchy to be deeply wrong, and called pro-monarchy Americans disciples of despotism. Washington demonstrated his commitments in 1782, following a letter from one of his officers named Colonel Louis Nicolay. At the time, Congress was struggling to pay the army, and a sense of anger was building in the ranks. Some men, such as Colonel Nicolay, believed that alternative leadership was needed since Congress clearly wasn't up to the task. Nicolay wrote to Washington on May 22, 1782, suggesting that Washington assume the power of a king to keep the nation on the right track. Nicolay argued that Washington's leadership qualities would, quote, be most likely to conduct and direct us in the smoother paths of peace. Washington was insulted. No incident in the course of the war in me triggers painful feelings as your message. That such ideas are circulating in the army, as you expressed it. That his own men might turn against Republican ideals was appalling to him. He continued, if you have any regard for your country, concern for yourself or posterity, or respect for me, banish these thoughts from your mind, and never communicate them again. Sure enough, Washington lived up to these words. He did not use his military power to seize civilian power after the war. On December 23, 1783, with the British defeated and American independence assured, Washington resigned his commission before Congress. It was a symbolic surrender of military power to civilian. Laying the power aside, he returned to his estate at Mount Vernon. It was an act of humility and restraint so impressive that even King George III remarked that it made Washington the greatest man in the world. Washington was emulating the actions of one of his heroes, the Roman Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus had been a major figure in Rome, and one of its most respected leaders in the 5th century BC, before retiring to his cabbage farm when his work was done. However, both Washington and Cincinnatus would be called again to power. Cincinnatus for a term as dictator, Washington to serve as president. Both men executed their duties faithfully, and when the terms of office finished, peacefully laid them aside once more and returned to their farms. Even while in office, Washington rejected the monarchical title of Your Excellency for the more humble Mr. President. So Washington didn't want to be king, but he didn't seem to want power in general either. He wielded it because people asked him to. Therefore, we have to ask why the American people didn't want to make him king. The obvious answer is that the revolution was a revolution against monarchy. The unaccountable power of a divinely sanctioned monarch who could not be removed by the people without violence was what they set out to demolish in the first place. The American people were enthused by the ideas of freedom. Communities wanted to govern themselves, to be free of unnecessary oversight. This mentality of liberty was what had driven the many settlers to America in the first place. A king simply didn't fit into that model. Nor did a king align with new ideas of human equality that the revolutions in America and France had spread. The idea that a man might be elevated to high office simply by his birth flew in the face of the revolution's ideas of man's natural rights. As the Declaration of Independence had so eloquently put it, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Obviously, the issue of slavery or the treatment of Native Americans showed the limit of this definition, but it definitely applied in matters of power and office. The principles of liberty and equality, and the critiques of hereditary and monarchical power, contained in works like Thomas Paine's wildly popular pamphlet, had already convinced millions of Americans that the days of monarchies were over. Now, we can argue that the average American never read most of the books and essays where these ideas were refined and explained. That's fair, although Paine's Common Sense was read by an estimated 2.5 million people at the time of the Revolution. No matter how deeply read the typical American was on these principles, though, they clearly lived by them. Alexis de Tocqueville was a French writer who wrote extensively about America in the decades after Washington's death. He observed that the Republican ideals of the Revolution were still powerfully embedded in American society. "The people," he wrote, "reign over the American political world as God rules over the universe." The early American people were active in governing themselves, and fully believed in the power of popular politics. Tocqueville noted that any issue or cause had political groups organizing around it. This level of political engagement was unheard of in Europe, even in post-revolutionary France. Far from wanting a king, the American people would rather solve issues themselves. They liked Washington, but were never going to surrender that power to him. Digging deeper into the founding documents of the United States, we can also see how a king wasn't compatible with the moral and philosophical foundations of the country. An obvious place to see this is in the American concept of legitimate power. As a Christian nation, power came from God, but was invested in the people of the United States, who chose to organize into states and found a federal government. The basic assumption of the American system was that people naturally had their rights and powers, but chose to allow the government to limit some of them for the sake of making a society. Contrast that with the monarchical system. In a monarchy, God granted power to the monarch, who might then pass it down to lesser officials. In Britain, this meant the king, or later, Parliament was the supreme authority, and all power flowed down from it. So the concept of a king simply didn't fit into any American conception of power. Virtually all monarchies also required religious sanction. Monarchs have always been able to claim some superior, spiritual stamp of approval that elevates them above lesser officials. But as we saw in America, the people as a whole already had this divine support. God had endowed them with certain unalienable rights. But even if Washington had tried to make such a justification for kingship on religious grounds, it was practically impossible. America was a Christian nation, but it was home to many denominations of Christianity, whose precise theology and visions were different. Trying to establish a religious justification for any aspect of government beyond the most vague terms would inevitably alienate some Americans, and possibly cause the entire thing to collapse. This is the same reason that the First Amendment to the Constitution forbids the government from establishing a state religion. To do so would divide American society, and make a United States impossible. Even setting aside all the fancy philosophical or religious arguments, the American Revolution broke out because they felt monarchy simply didn't work. No one man, no matter how talented, was capable of managing an area as vast and varied as the United States. The kings of England, which was arguably one of Europe's most sophisticated and well-governed countries, could not govern well enough to prevent revolution. To overthrow an inefficient monarchy just to replace it with another inefficient monarchy was absurd on its face. Even if Washington had been made king, and if by some magic the Americans threw away their ideas to let him, it's unlikely he would have been able to build a monarchy that could effectively govern the United States. And even if Washington was up to the task, he died without heirs. Succession would have been an issue. and there have been precious few people in history with the talent and humility to follow in Washington's footsteps in the first place. It would have been doomed to fail. The answer for why Washington didn't become a king then is simple. He never wanted it, nor did the American people. Their revolution opposed it. Their society didn't support it, their values contradicted it, and the realities of governing the United States wouldn't have allowed it to succeed. And so, Washington became America's first president, and, depending on who you ask, remains its best.